Brian Kertson is here to talk to us about his cougar research. Brian's with the WDFW, the carnivore research scientist. He has over 20 years with the research and field experience. He's got lots of great stories, and he's extremely knowledgeable on the subject. So he's going to tell us about interactions with cougars, both with their natural prey, and then when they are closer to habitation, interactions with people, pets, etc. He'll talk about territories. Anyway, great program. I'm excited to see it. I hope you enjoyed as much as I do. And thank you so much, Brian, for being here. So with that, let's turn it over to Brian.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the introduction, Gary, and thank you to the Spokane Audubon Society for hosting me tonight. Let me host disabled participant screen sharing. Well, come on. There we go. Now I got it. All right, let me pull this up, share, and we'll launch it here. All right, you guys see that okay? All right, I see some thumbs up, some nine. All right, great. Well, again, good evening. Thanks again for having me. Just sort of out of the gate here, I'm going to warn you, it's not hard for me to talk shop when I'm relaying sort of my experience and the work that I've done with cougars and stuff. So I'm going to do my best to kind of stay on track and keep this moving, because yeah, sometimes you can get me going and I will take you much further than you want to go. So I'm going to cover a lot of ground, and I'm going to try to do it pretty quickly. A lot of this stuff is I've tried to put it into terms that's a little more digestible, a little more general. But it does have pretty strong empirical support from the work that I've done, the work that my colleagues here in Washington have done, and then of course, given the wide range of cougars, they're well studied throughout the Western Hemisphere. And what's really fascinating, and I think what you'll see tonight, is that a lot of this stuff is pretty consistent from place to place and setting to setting, which really just sort of speaks to just how remarkably resilient these animals are. Just a real quick intro. Gary kind of hit the high points here. So I am the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's carnivore researcher, a role that I've been in for a little over 10 years. But I've been doing various cougar research projects for the better part of 2 decades. I did do a brief tour of duty with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game as a research biologist for them, working on a wolf elk project. So I do things other than cougars, although the bulk of my experience really is cougar specific. So as Gary said, a little more than 20 years, and I've captured several hundred of these animals and followed them just about everywhere they go to see the things that they do and how they do them, to really consistent with the work that my agency does. It's really sort of consistent with that preserve, protect, perpetuate mission that the agency has. So it's to inform management and conservation. So very much the way the research I do is of the applied nature. All right, so let's just get right into it. One of the things I sort of like to lay out here first to sort of set the table is that we live in an increasingly urban world, one in which human beings exert considerable influence across landscapes, ecosystems, with impacts on a great diversity of wildlife. Those impacts can be particularly acute, though, for carnivores, because as long as there have been people and there have been carnivores, they have competed for space and resources. And so there's a sort of a unique relationship that exists. And of course, not only do we compete with these animals, sometimes they've eaten us. And so that leaves a pretty strong evolutionary fingerprint in our brains that we still carry with us to this day. And I really like this image of NASA. This is NASA's Earth at Night. This was from 2016. It just really sort of shows you how pervasive the human presence is across the globe. Now, in spite of that, you have probably the most adaptable and successful large carnivore on the planet, if not the most, certainly arguably one of the most. So historically, cougars have ranged from as far south as Patagonia, the tip of South America there, all the way up to northern British Columbia. And historically, which includes these areas in yellow here on this range map, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, their current range has been greatly reduced following European colonization of the New World. But interestingly enough, they are starting to make their way back east here in the Americas. But this resilience, this adaptability that really is demonstrated here in this range map, because when you think about it, the diversity of landscapes and settings that this encapsulates, from tropical rainforests to the high desert Andes, montane environments, temperate rainforests. It's really sort of remarkable just where these animals roam and what they do when they're there. And this adaptability has really sort of served them well in this increasingly urban world. Now, cougars are present here in Washington. They're native to Washington. People always ask, well, how many cougars do we have? How many cougars do you think we have? And the reality is, in terms of the total population, we're probably looking at somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 animals, although we don't have a really rock solid population estimate. A lot of that has to do with the difficulty that exists in enumerating their populations. Sometimes you'll see a population estimate that ranges between 1,800 and 2,200 animals. And what that really is what we consider independent, or cats that are no longer in the presence of mom. And the reason that we use that 1,800 to 2,200 number is largely because that's the population that can legally be hunted here in Washington. Your total population estimate would include spotted kittens, dependent on their moms, that sort of thing. They can't be legally hunted, so when we're doing season setting and things like that, we tend to focus on the segment of the population that can be harvested. And Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife is responsible for regulating cougar harvest. Again, they're a game species here in Washington with it can be hunted through basically September 1st through the end of April. That's only one of our management objectives, is providing that recreational opportunity. You see there that we've got actually pretty diverse management objectives associated with these animals. And that's really what makes them so challenging, right? On one hand, we provide what we believe to be sustainable harvest, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we maintain stable populations well into the future. We also want to minimize risk to public safety and private property. That's a big part of the research that I've done that we'll talk about. But you also see there this aesthetic cultural value thing. And what that really is that's our attempt to reflect the non-consumptive values that people have towards these animals. Some people just like knowing that cougars are out there, whether or not they ever want to hunt one or whether or not they ever see one. Just the fact that Washington is a wild enough place to have these animals it's a value to them. And this kind of shows you everywhere that you find cougars here in Washington, the areas in the green. So well distributed. If you know Washington, which I'm assuming most of you do, this correlates pretty closely with the forested landscape of Washington. Although our own research has shown that cougars are much more common in the Columbia Basin and some of these shrub steppe habitats and riparian habitats that exist within the Columbia Basin than we previously thought. Basically, there's 104 100,000 square kilometers of suitable cougar habitat in Washington, of which 89,000 falls under the jurisdiction purview of WDFW. The remaining lands tend to be tribal lands or federal lands, specifically national parks. But herein lies the rub. So while we have lots of cougar habitat and what I would consider to be a pretty healthy cougar population, Washington also has lots of people. And in fact, that human population is growing, and it's projected to reach close to 8.4 million people by 2030. And with those people comes a loss of habitat. Now, not all of that habitat is cougar habitat, but a good portion of it is. And what that loss of habitat does is not only does it sort of reduce the landscape that's available to these animals, it also brings about greater proximity and overlap between cougars and people. And in fact, cougars and lots of different species of wildlife. Some of those species do all very well and actually sort of prosper close to us. Others can't tolerate us at all. Cougars surprisingly are kind of somewhere in the middle. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit, but this increased proximity, this increased overlap between cougars and people really presents a number of challenges. And the way I sort of like to think about this is Washington is the smallest Western state, but it has the second highest human population. So we're really at the tip of the spear when it comes to these issues related to carnivore and human proximity. And what's really interesting is Washington is only one of 4 states in the lower 48 that has a full suite of large carnivores. So I've been talking largely about cougars thus far, but we do have probably between 18 and 20,000 black bears statewide. We have a recovering wolf population, and we do in fact have a few grizzly bears. We don't have a lot of them, but we do have some grizzly bears in the Northeast. We may have grizzly bears, one or a few of them in the North Cascades. It's a bit of an unknown. But this is interesting because the other 3 states in the lower 48 that have their full suite of large carnivores, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, Washington's human population is more than 2.5 times larger than the combined populations of those 3 states. So again, we really are sort of on the precipice here of these challenges that of trying to maintain healthy, viable populations of these large carnivores, and in this case, cougars, while also, minimizing risk to public safety and private property, these sorts of things. And it's challenging. It's really challenging because it deals with competing values, competing perspectives. Sometimes the science isn't as clear as you'd like it to be for decision makings. But that's kind of where we are, and really this is a challenge that's only going to increase in the future. So when we think about this and this idea of cougar-human interaction, and this is one of my all-time favorite pictures. When you study cougars in these wildland urban landscapes, like I have for the better part of 2 decades, you learn very quickly to never say never, even on some of the most ridiculous stories you hear. Because sometimes the things that people tell you turn out to be true and they have convincing evidence. And this was one, a story of a woman that and her husband who came through a deer check station here in Western Washington, and they were both just frantic. And they said they had just seen a pair of cougars and they had jumped on the car. Basically, the husband was out deer hunting and the wife was in the car reading, and she looked up, saw some movement in the clear cut and didn't think anything of it, went back to reading, looked up again. Here's these 2 little cougars, 20 feet from the car and or from the truck. And then next thing you know, this is what you get, the cat on the hood. Now, when she came through, she was very frantic. We weren't really sure if she was, what this was. And of course, I clearly remember the truck. It was a Chevy S10, compact pickup, but it was white. And so as they're telling us this, they just sort of get out and start pointing to the hood. And sure enough, on the hood, there are muddy cougar tracks all over the hood. And this was pre-digital camera days. And so we made them go down into North Bend to the 1 hour Photoshop and develop the pictures, and we paid for them and had them make us a copy. And this is kind of one that that came out of that. But it does a nice job of sort of exemplifying just how close cougars and people can be. Now, in this case, this was a pair of 10-month-old kittens. And the one universal truth about cats, whether you're talking about tabby cats on up to tigers, is they are very, very curious. Now, in this case, the woman in the car really didn't much care about their curiosity. It was a cougar on the hood, but it wasn't necessarily nefarious. Now, where a lot of the action is with these cougar-human interactions, and cougar-human interactions can take lots of forms. We do consider sightings cougar-human interactions, only because the law requires us to consider them interactions and to catalog them accordingly. But there's also encounters, which is basically a sighting plus proximity, where both you and the cougar react to each other's presence. Whereas with a sighting, you might see a cat and the cat doesn't react to you at all. And it could be far away, that sort of thing. The most common form of interaction, which is actually not really so much humans as it is about livestock and pets, and that's depredations. And then the extremely rare actual attacks on people. But most of the action takes place here at what we call the wildland-urban interface. And what you can think of as the wildland-urban interface is where this open space, undeveloped habitat butts up against areas that has a significant human presence or a developed human presence, typically in the form of a structure, often a home. And in some parts of the landscape, like this particular area here in Western Washington, where I did a couple of studies, that wildland-urban interface can be pretty distinctly quantified and displayed, just like it is here. Now, as I alluded to, this is, maintaining viable populations of cougars while sort of minimizing the potential risks that they present to people is a growing concern for the agencies that are responsible for managing these animals. And so often they turn to somebody like me and they say, hey, we have questions. Can you go get us answers? And usually I say, how much money are you going to give me to get you those answers? Because if you give me enough money, I can answer that question. But we've actually done quite a bit of research here in Washington with cougars because they are an important species. There's considerable public interest in a lot of different arenas. And so we've sort of taken that head on here at the Department of Fish and Wildlife with our university collaborators. And we've actually engaged in several cougar research projects over the last 20 to 25 years. And here are their locations, pretty well distributed throughout the state, sort of reflecting the diversity of the landscape and the issues that are present. But relative to other states and provinces that have cougars, we're sort of ahead of the game in terms of the information that we have related to sort of all facets of cougars. Now, you'll notice that there is kind of this black hole out here on the peninsula, but there is a large cougar research project that's underway right now by the, it's not a WDFW project or a university project. It's being led by the Wildcat Conservation Organization, Panthera, and a number of their tribal partners. It's a big project, some exciting stuff coming out of there that should fill in like one of the last real information gaps that we have, at least geographically. Now, in terms of the type of research that we've done, these are sort of overarching topics that we've looked at, but these are big subjects with lots of sort of sub questions and details and nuance there. But really, there's not a whole lot about cougar ecology and behavior that we have not examined someplace here in Washington with an intensive field effort. Now, most of the stuff that I'm going to relay to you tonight is sort of focused on these sort of 5 broader overarching topics. But again, there's quite a bit of work that has been done that just don't really have the chance to get into here. All right, well, let's start actually getting down into the weeds when we're talking about cougars and how they make their living and what they do and really what they're about. And the first place we got to go to really understand cougars, you have to understand that they have a very well-defined and structured social organization. And by that, I mean how they interact with each other, males with females, adults with subadults, reproduction, territoriality, all these things flow from this social organization, or basically, their societal rules, for lack of a better term. First and foremost, the thing that really drives these systems, like the governor of Cougar Town, are these dominant large adult males. So male cougars are territorial, and they occupy a home range on average here in Washington that's about 175 square miles. It's very unusual to see one smaller than 125 square miles, and in some cases I've seen adult males that will roam as far as 300 plus square miles. That's also unusual, but either way, it's a lot of area. And what they're doing is they're trying to maintain exclusive access to as many reproductive females as possible. Now, that doesn't mean that these male territories don't overlap. And in fact, that amount of overlap can be pretty variable, but at least theoretically, they're doing their best to keep all the other males out so they have the ladies to themselves. Now, females practice something somewhat different. It's what we call mutual avoidance, which can take many shapes, many forms. But basically, the key difference here is they're not necessarily territorial like a male. They're not actively defending space against other cougars. What they typically do, though, is they tend not to be in the same place at the same time with other females that they overlap with. And unlike males, who are driven almost exclusively by access to females, females are driven primarily by the access and availability of prey. And that's because they do all of the rearing of offspring, right? And you'll notice a considerably smaller home range here, roughly, a third of the size of the males. And so the typical male home range encompasses all or part of 2 to 4 female home ranges, although it can be even more than that. And I'll show you here in a second. Just to kind of give you an idea of what this looks like, this was from some research that I did here in Western Washington, just to give you kind of lay of land. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see my pointer here, but this is Highway 2 right here, I-90 through there. This is Lake Sammamish, Lake Washington. This is an area just east of Seattle. So Cascade Foothills into North Bend, Snoqualmie Pass would be, down in here. But what you see here is this is that female distribution on the landscape. And so what it's pretty obvious here is quite a bit of spatial overlap. But again, they tend not to be in the same place at the same time. And some of these females are very likely to be related. Now you contrast that with the males. And in this case, these two males actually had, by male standards, quite a bit of overlap. And I suspect the reason for that is this was a very stable population with very low mortality rates, very limited turnover in the individuals. And both of these toms were old. In the case, the guy in the green, he was 7 years old in 2014, whereas the cat in the red was 9 years old. So they had probably been neighbors for quite a long time, and they had sort of I'm assuming they had a pretty good knowledge of who was out there on the landscape and where they were and where they spent most of their time. Now, cougars don't always interact with each other directly. They actually use olfactory cues on the landscape to convey territorial boundaries. We call them scrapes. They literally just sort of, rub the dirt in place with their two back paws and put a scent mark there that conveys all kinds of information about who they are. their condition, how recently they were there. It's really fascinating. It's sort of like an unseen roadmap that exists in the woods about who lives where and how they're doing. So when you think about sort of the spatial ecology, this social organization system in this increasingly urban world that is sort of rapidly expanding people across the landscape, one of the things that I set out to determine was just how much time are these guys spending in areas with an extensive human presence. And so this is kind of a typical cougar male home range. It could be a female, but in this case I used a male. What you're looking at there is actually a three-dimensional plot of their home range, what's known as a utilization distribution. We don't necessarily need to get in the weeds about this unless you really want to talk probability functions, which we can do all night if you'd like. I don't think that's why you're here, but basically the areas in red, the peaks, are where the animal has the greatest amount of use. The areas in the blue are the lowest. The area in the yellow line actually depicts that wildland urban interface, and the black dots are actually houses. And so this is real data from Western Washington. And what it shows you is that, yeah, in this particular case, this cat spent about 10% of his UD overlapped with areas with residential development. So he spent about 10% of his time in places with people. And what my research has really shown was that, in fact, the majority of cougars in any given population in Washington that are adjacent to any amount of residential development actually spend some time very, very close to people. In fact, 75% of any given population is likely to use an area with residential development at least once. And on average, spends about 16% of their time there. I have seen cats spend as much as, 70% of their time in residential areas. I've seen some cats that spend very, very little time, but typically it's individuals. It sort of exists on the periphery of their home range. And what they're really doing is they're exploiting suitable habitat and resources within the matrix of residential development. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but there are very distinct demographic patterns with males. Almost all males use residential development because of their wide-ranging movements and large home ranges, where females, it's sort of an all or none. If you've got these smaller lands, home ranges that are oriented on the landscape, those that are far from the interface never use residential development, while animals that have home ranges at or near the wildland urban interface use those areas pretty extensively. And here I'm just going to sort of walk you through some examples of what this looks like. So this is actually one of my collared adult females that I studied. She was monitored between 2013 through the end of 2015. So each one of those little yellow cougars represents a single GPS fix from her collar. The red line there is the wildland urban interface. And this image here just sort of, and this is only a snippet of her home range. I mean, this is not all of her data. I'm just I pulled an example out of kind of something that kind of made the point that I wanted to make, which was most of that use of residential development occurs right at the wildland urban interface. I mean, there are individuals that will push further into residential development, particularly if they're dispersers, transient animals. But in reality, in terms of that, the typical cat, this is pretty normal, is what you're looking at there. Now, in some cases, those areas can be really, really well developed. This is Snoqualmie. The highway there that you can see coming through is actually I-90 there. This was a young male, approximately 3 years old. And I really like this one because it really demonstrates that use of like forested, undeveloped, that what I call that suitable habitat within the matrix. And in some cases, very, very densely developed. And, if you look at it here, the cats come right up to the edge of this, almost urban density of development, but they don't really cross into it. I also like this. I like this image a lot because my house is right there. So this was like one of the easiest cats I ever had to track. I would just like, I'd get some data in the morning and I'd be like, oh, he's around. And so I could go out to my truck in the driveway and turn on the telemetry, and I could hear him often because it's, you don't see the topography here, but this is on top of a hill. But again, it sort of it demonstrates that ability to sort of get in there and do what cats do. This is another adult female near the town of Carnation along Griffin Creek. And, you know, often people will ask me, well, so what are they doing? Why are they there? And really, it's about food. It's about the ability to access food. And this, again, this is an adult female from 2 years of data. And all these places where you see those cougars sort of cluster together, those are actually predation events. Those are kills. And you can really see how, you know, clear they are there. And in some cases, I've highlighted ones that were very, very close to houses or development. And so what this cat was doing, we went into these clusters to see, and in fact, she was killing predominantly deer in these residential areas. Now, what's really interesting is if you look closely, you'll see this huge cluster right there. That was actually a den site. And I went in, and that was where she gave birth to 2 little males. We captured them right there, and it really drives home the importance of prey in these landscapes, because I will tell you that female cougars always put their dens in places that have lots of prey, because when those kittens are born, their movements are, that 65 square mile home range becomes about 2 square miles for anywhere between 4 and 8 weeks, because they're going out, they're hunting, they're feeding, then they'll come back to the den, they'll nurse. And so they can't travel very much because they've got to constantly check on those kittens. And so they tend to put these places, they tend to orient their den in a target rich environment. And so in this case, it happened to be close to people. And again, it speaks to really the adaptability and the resilience of these animals. Now, I don't have a lot of graphs in my presentation. I try not to put a lot of graphs in presentations because people don't like graphs, but this is a pretty good one. And so what this does is, this was from 4 different studies where we looked at how residential development patterns affect the likelihood of cougars being present in a 1 square kilometer cell. And the takeaway here is that cougars really responded to residential development the same way everywhere you went in Washington. Basically, the shape of these curves are, we could not find any differences in them. And the short answer here is that as residential development increases, cougar use declines. Not surprising, there's an inverse relationship. But what was interesting was how much more development cougars tolerated in Western Washington than they did in Eastern Washington. And really what that revealed was sort of the differences in residential development patterns. So in Western Washington, you have a lot of these high density, urban density developments like you see in that top picture, where in a lot of more rural parts of Eastern Washington, you have these lower density, exurban, diffuse development. Now, granted, all development types are present throughout Washington, but really, in terms of the study areas we looked at, there was much more of this high density development in the Western Washington. And what that does is that it basically, there are way more houses there, but they're concentrated in a smaller area, so the footprint is smaller. And so cats do a pretty good job of being able to avoid it, right? It's sort of, all right, that over there is not for me, but everything else is, and sort of they work the periphery. Whereas when you've got this low density diffuse development, cats are bumping into houses all the time. Now, they can make a good use of that up into a point, but then once it kind of gets above that, they tend not to use those areas very more. And so when the development is very, very dense like this, they're able to exploit, that suitable habitat more easily than they are in the low density stuff. It's sort of counterintuitive. All right, well, let's transition a little bit here and start sort of talking about what these guys are really about. So, of course, cougars really are an apex predator. I mean, they sit at the top of the food chain, and I think if like aliens landed on Earth tomorrow and you were trying to explain to them what a predator is, I think you could not go wrong if you showed them a cat. I think cats just sort of look like what they do, right? They just athletic, muscular, agile, eyes, large eyes, focused, are centered on the front of their face, big teeth, sharp claws. Like they look like they eat other animals to survive, and they certainly do. Now, cougars are an obligate carnivore, and all that means is that they have to eat other animals to survive. And the animals that they primarily prey upon, of course, are large-bodied ungulates. And in Washington, that's any one of our deer species: mule deer, white-tailed deer, and of course, black-tailed deer here in Western Washington, and elk. Although I have seen them in our recent predator prey project take prey as large as adult cow moose. It does happen. And that's because, again, touching on this theme of opportunistic and highly adaptable, right? They'll take prey as small as ground squirrels, snowshoe hares, mountain beavers, things like that. Again, all the way up to the things like moose. Domestic species are pretty uncommon. And in fact, in my studies, they rarely accounted for more than 2 to 2.5% of the prey items we documented. And in fact, that's probably an overestimate, because we put much more effort into looking at food habits in residential areas than we did in wildlands. So a lot of wildland kills went unexplored. But again, it's for the population itself, it's not a major source of calories. People often ask me, so the universal question I get, like, how often are they killing? How many kills do they make? And you hear a lot this idea of 1 deer per week. I like to explain it to people that it's not 1 deer per week, literally. It's the energetic equivalent of a deer a week. And that energetic equivalent can take lots of form. 1 elk killed every 16 days energetically is probably pretty close to 1 deer killed every 7 days. 4 beavers killed in 10 days is the energetic equivalent of a deer killed every 7 days. So it really varies. And it varies both in terms of the composition, but it also depends on what's available on the landscape. Cougar diet often is a reflection of the prey community. Males kill larger prey than females, although females will often kill more frequently than males because they're supporting offspring. And so adult females with subadult offspring have some of the highest kill rates you're going to see. In terms of impacts on ungulate populations, on prey populations, which is always a topic of interest for the public and often a controversial and contentious one. All I'll really say about that is that the impacts of cougars, it's very, very situationally specific, and not just cougars. That's same with wolves, grizzly bears, any tigers, any large carnivore. It really depends on the conditions locally on the ground, and it's also incredibly complicated. We could do a full week series just talking about predator prey dynamics and barely scratch the surface. This just gives you an idea of how diverse their diet is in these wildland urban landscapes. The dark green there is black-tailed deer. The lighter shades of green, the one lighter shade of green is, of course, elk. And then sometimes when they killed neonates of deer and elk, we couldn't really tell what it was, so it ended up unknown. The one interesting thing here that I always like to point out is that big blue blob that constituted 22% of the prey items we documented. Those were beavers. Poor beavers. A lot of people don't realize this, but in Western Washington, beavers are gigantic. it's not unusual for beavers to grow to be 40 or 50 pounds, and they're laden with fat. And cougars could find them just about everywhere, including areas far from water. Beavers actually travel on land, away from streams, lakes, wetlands, more often than people realize. And so cougars would find these, and man, they would often, all I would find is just a set of buck teeth. That's it. You'd literally find like just those big old incisors and maybe part of the skull, and just didn't stand a chance. My old colleague used to refer to them as sort of like the milk dud of the cougar diet, just like soft and gooey and calorie rich. I promised I didn't have a lot of graphs. I think this is the only other graph I have in here. What this really just, the take home here is it just shows how the composition of cougar diet changes as a function of residential development patterns. And so when you're in these wildland and residential environments, deer is a pretty common prey item. But what changes is when you move into these residential areas, that those synanthrope species, those are species that do well in areas with a human presence. Think raccoons, coyotes, possums, things like that. You see those species become much more common in cougar diet. And then what they're replacing is that in the wildlands, which is not just the beavers that I mentioned before, it's also mountain beavers here in Western Washington. And I don't know if you can find an expert on mountain beavers to give you a talk, you should jump on that. They are a fascinating little animal they're endemic to here in Washington. In fact, if you talk to folks in the museum world, when they trade specimens with natural history museums across the country and the world, whenever somebody wants, like whenever they want something from another museum, that museum will always ask for mountain beavers, because they're like a very ancestral species too. Like they haven't evolved very much in terms of other rodents and stuff. But anyway, I digress. Now, one of the unique characteristics about cougars is what they do with their prey. They do what we call caching, which is sort of nature's refrigerator. And I've got two examples there for you. The lower right one is just when a cat killed this buck who happened to be radio collared. He killed it right on a logging road here in Western Washington, and he drug it into the ditch and he covered it up with whatever he could find. The example there in the upper left corner is much more typical of a Western Washington or forest landscape cache. You can see the leg and the hoof sticking out here. You can see a foot sticking out here. If you remove all that sword fern and moss and debris, there's an adult deer under there. When cougars kill their prey, they eat the heart, the liver, and the lungs first. They do that because they're the most nutritious part of the animal, but also cougars are incapable of synthesizing their own vitamin A, so they have to get it from their prey. So eating the heart is pretty critical, and they'll do that first before moving into the muscle mass. Here's just a little video to kind of show you what that kind of looks like. So you got a cat pulling this, as you see, it's kind of all the ferns go flying, and there's a whole deer there. This happened to be a family group, so this deer was pretty well picked over, but it is sort of a unique characteristic of this species. All right, let's transition a little bit and talk about competition. And this is for those that were on earlier and heard me talking with Woody. He was asking about the Predator Prey project, which is a huge project that I'm part of that's just wrapping up. And one of the big focuses for us doing the carnivore research is looking at competition between wolves and cougars, and specifically the impacts of recolonizing wolves on cougars. And here's just a little bit of data from just north of where you guys are there in Stevens and Ponderay County. And those yellow dots are an adult male cougars GPS fixes. And then the red dots represent fixes from collared individuals in the Carpenter Ridge wolf pack. So what you'll see there is actually quite a bit of spatial overlap. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So real quick, intraspecific versus interspecific. So intraspecific would be cougars competing with cougars. Inter is obviously cougars competing with other large carnivores. In the world of ecology, it's pretty well accepted that intraspecific competition is a much more important factor for wildlife populations. You know, individuals competing with members of their own species is a much bigger evolutionary driver than, say, competing with other species. That's not to say competing with other species doesn't have an effect. It's just not as, the effects just aren't as strong as they are as competing with, you know, similar individuals. So the two big competitors for cougars here in Washington are black bears and, of course, these recolonizing gray wolves. As that image shows, overlap is pretty common, especially with bears and cougars. And as wolves become more common, there is a good degree of spatial overlap, although there is some spatial partitioning based on sort of the landscape characteristics, mainly terrain, that is reflective of the differences in terms. Cougars are a stalking predator. They have to approach their prey unseen, undetected, to a close distance before launching an attack, where wolves are coursing predators that tend to run down their prey over longer distances. And so they tend to prefer more gentle rolling hills, less densely vegetated, that sort of thing. Now, cougars are considered subordinate competitors to both bears and wolves. And this is largely because wolves and bears steal kills from cougars somewhat regularly. In some cases, wolves will kill cougars. That's been reasonably well documented in the Rocky Mountains following reintroduction in central Idaho and Yellowstone. What's interesting is Washington has kind of been unique to those northern Rocky situations because here it seems like cougars tend to dish it out more than they take it. And in fact, with our collared wolves, cougars are one of the leading sources of natural mortality for wolves here in Washington, where, at least in the Predator Prey Project, we didn't document any mortality of any sex or age class of cougars from wolves. We did document cougars killing wolves in Northeast Washington. This is kind of gives you a good example of what you would sort of expect. So remember earlier when I talked about those GPS points that cluster up, that's indicative of a predation event. So here is an adult male. He happened to kill a calf moose in that cluster right there. And that red dot represents the wolf pack that showed up. What I didn't show you was the cat had been there for probably 3 days feeding on this moose. The wolf pack showed up. And then the next location that I had of that cougar, 8 hours later, he was 7 miles away. So 1 or 2 wolves, a cougar doesn't really have any problems with 1 or 2 wolves. 7 or 8 wolves, cougar has a problem with 7 or 8 wolves. And so as a solitary predator, you don't want to risk injury. So flight is better than fight in those sort of situations. And this is sort of typical of what we would see. In terms of bears, it's a little different. It tends to be a little less confrontational. Here is an adult female that I was monitoring. I'd set up cameras to monitor kitten survival. And so that little trail that she walked down there, you could see her kind of licking her chops. She had killed a deer up there. And, you know, doing what cougars do, feed, sleep, go back, feed some more, sleep. Very, very typical. Well, what also kind of happens in these situations, and what you'll see, is the nose knows. And in this case, bears, they have an amazing sense of smell, and particularly in the summer as they're entering into hyperphagia, these bears find these cougar kills usually by day 3 or 4, sometimes sooner. And this is just a little bear, but still, in this case, you know, the nose knows and is kind of telling this bear, like, hey, there's something good up there. And of course, when I went to retrieve my camera, this deer kill had clearly been scavenged by a bear, most likely this bear, possibly more than one bear. And again, that tends to be sort of the common relationship. All right, turning the page again and talking a little bit about population dynamics. This is one that's folks tend to have a lot of interest in as well. I mean, the big take home here is, not surprisingly, the size of a cougar population densities. It's really determined by the amount of biomass, the amount of food that's on the landscape. That's pretty universal for large carnivores everywhere. There is sort of a ceiling that likely exists. They're not fully what we would call self-limiting, but certainly you could keep dumping deer into a landscape. Theoretically, you could keep dumping deer into a landscape exponentially. And at some point, though, the population is not going to grow anymore because of, particularly that male tolerance for other males. The other things that are sort of important to think about here is, no matter where you go in North and South America, often even in remote landscapes, humans are the principal source of mortality for cougar populations. Really, human beings are the limiting factor for large carnivore populations across the globe, not just cougars. What's interesting is that even as the amount of food and space and resources increases, reproductive output doesn't really. So pretty much everywhere you go with cougars, the average litter is 2 to 3 kittens. Now, you might get some changes in survival rates of those kittens, and both through the first year of life and then through independence. But at least in terms of like the number of kittens, females don't produce more offspring with more food. And it's a bit of a head scratcher why that is, but there's a pretty robust data set to demonstrate that. Cougars also, because they're so wide ranging, and this immigration effect that they have, and I'll show you some slide here in a moment, they have what we call sources and sinks. And the way to think about this are source populations, the birth rate and the emigration rate is greater than the death rate and the immigration rate. So the number of cats that are being produced and leaving is more than the number of cats that are dying and coming in. It's not a true, what we would call metapopulation. There's some distinct dissimilarities there, but it definitely does operate under these source sink dynamics. And the other thing that's, that to me is really encouraging about these populations, they tend to be really resilient, even in the face of what can be pretty significant human mortality. Just touching on the reproduction, typically in the first 2 to 3 years, females are sexually mature at 2 years of age. Males tend to be sexually mature at about 2.5, 3 years of age, but typically don't breed until they set up their own territory, which happens between 3 and 4 years of age. The generation time is roughly every 2 years. And cougars are somewhat unique in that they can breed throughout the year. And I've seen litters throughout the year, although we do have what we call a birth pulse in July, August, and September that we believe coincides with an abundance of ungulate prey on the landscape, mainly in the form of elk calves, which are born in May and early June, and then deer fawns, which are born in June and early July. And these cats stay with these kittens, if they survive, typically stay with mom for the first 1.5 years before they head out on their own. And you can see what I was talking about with some of the source sinks dynamics. These are animals that emigrated or dispersed out of our study area, that little polygon in blue. And in one case made it all the way to the Columbia River. The cat went to the shore, maybe thought about swimming it, and then ultimately decided against it. You also see a cat that went all the way there into the heart of the North Cascades, went up to about 7,000 feet in the middle of the night, and then turned around and came down and was like, yeah, that's even a little rugged for me. All right, well, let's talk about the backyard component of this wildland urban equation. We've talked a lot about, the mountaintop part. Let's talk a little more backyard. Well, I mentioned this before, and it's worth saying again that their use of these residential areas is pretty commonplace it's more often than not, most individuals know how to navigate around people. The characteristics of the landscape. So by that, I mean the amount of forest or undeveloped habitat, residential development levels and patterns, what type of prey there, and how many of these are all factors that are sort of intricately entwined with how much time cougars are spending in these landscapes and how they're using them. There's very much like a positive feedback loop there. The other thing I'll mention is that these cats aren't weirdos. They're not doing things differently than, say, cats in wilderness areas. Residential development doesn't necessarily represent unsuitable habitat to a cougar. Sometimes it just represents modified habitat. Now, to a point, there's a point where, again, that figure I showed you earlier, the development becomes too great and it's not going to be used by cats. But when it sort of sits below that threshold, cats are pretty much just doing cat things, and they do all the things they do there that they do in wildland or wilderness environments. What is unique here is, unlike, say, a wilderness environment where it's primarily these ecological factors in play, there's a whole number of these anthropogenic factors, human factors that are in play with that really shape the animal's behavior and its ecology in these landscapes. Now, in terms of interactions themselves, you heard me mention some of this before. Now, while I mentioned that use of residential areas is pretty common, interactions with people are actually relatively uncommon compared to how much time they are present. And when we do have interactions, just like the use that I was showing you earlier, most of them occur pretty close to the wildland urban interface. On average, within 2 miles. They really don't stray a whole lot further from that. And in fact, as the cougar population grows, there's no evidence that they push further into residential areas. In fact, they just sort of that population growth either results in emigration via wildlands, or the animals just sort of set up shop predominantly in wildland habitats. In terms of the actual interactions themselves, again, depredations are the most common form. And really, we're talking about goat, sheep, llamas, and alpacas. Now, not to be flippant, but pretty much everything that eats meat eats sheep, coyotes, wolves, cougar. I mean, like, if I were to get a call tomorrow and someone says, "Oh, I've got a sheep depredation," yeah, okay, yeah, it could be a cougar. If I get a call about a goat depredation, it's usually a cougar. I don't know why, but goats are very, very common. Llamas and alpacas are also very common, but that one at least sort of makes sense to me. If, I mentioned earlier that cougars range as far south as, Patagonia in South America. Well, the llama and the alpaca are basically the domestic version of the guanaco and the vicuña, which is the primary prey of cougars in South America. And I have this running hypothesis, like, a lot of people don't know this, but cougars in North America actually went extinct like several, 100,000 years ago. And the cougar population was actually, North America was recolonized by cougars from South America. I just sort of figure, like, this is just evolutionary baggage. They're like, hey, wait a minute, I recognize that. I recognize that. I can make that work. And in terms of the actual depredations that we see, overwhelming majority, it's when animals are unsecured at night, like when they're just sort of left out at the pasture edge or close to the forest, something like that. Almost that tends to be the most common scenario. Now, encounters are really uncommon. Attacks are exceptionally rare. In terms of encounters, most of the, they can occur in both residential and wildland settings. When they occur in residential settings, this tends to be like a cougar in the backyard or a cougar on somebody's porch, something like that. When it's wildlands, it's somebody, hiking, mountain biking, something like that, and they bump into a cat. Attacks, on the other hand, so we've had 21 documented attacks on on cougars in Washington state, and roughly 150 documented attacks of cougars on people in the last 125 years in North America. The overwhelming majority of those occurred in wildland settings. There have been a few that have occurred in residential settings, but almost exclusively it's wildland areas. I'll talk a little bit more about that, and they almost always are recreationists. In terms of sort of the dynamic in play, this is the other theme that I want you to come away with here, is that this is a complicated, there's a lot of different factors in play, some cougar related, some are human related. The one thing that's research is really showing, though, is that a lot of this tends to be driven by individual behavior. Cougars are in fact unique individuals. I don't want to say they have unique personalities. I don't want to anthropomorphize them, but they really do. I mean, in my own experience, I've dealt with cats that are very, very shy. I've dealt with cats that are unusually curious. And on rare occasions, I've dealt with cats that are a little more aggressive, a little meaner, for lack of a better term. But there seems to be quite a bit of difference in terms of risk taking among individuals. And that's kind of, more and more research is showing that seems to be a major driver of this dynamic. This is just an oversimplified schematic sort of showing you all these different things, from outdoor recreation levels. You've heard me talk a lot about the residential development, and I mentioned the prey, but of course, how much back, most livestock depredation that we see tends to be of the sort of non-commercial variety. People that have goats, sheep, llamas in their backyard, often referred to as hobby farms, that sort of thing. There's not a lot of large commercial sheep operations in Washington. There's a few, and they do experience some depredation. But really, most of the action, again, is these smaller non-commercial outfits right there at the wildland urban interface. Okay, well, I would not be doing my due diligence if I didn't give you, my takeaway or my tips for how to avoid conflicts with these animals. And so, given that I've talked about, like, hey, most of the action is at the wildland urban interface, that makes the most sense as a place to start. And again, the presence of deer, elk, and alternate prey in these landscapes, if you can reduce the attractiveness of your property to these individuals, whether it be deer or elk, or encouraging raccoons or opossums near your house by feeding your pets outside, taking some simple steps to sort of reduce their presence there can ultimately lead to a reduced presence of cougars. I always use the analogy, it's like people love to watch deer and elk in the backyard and on their property and things like that. But if you are inviting deer and elk to your house for dinner, whether you realize it or not, you are indirectly inviting cougars over for dinner as well. And so by reducing their presence, that's a relatively straightforward way to sort of reduce the chance of encountering a cougar or having a depredation on your property. I mentioned earlier that most, and in fact, 89% of the depredations that I documented in my research over a 10-year period involved issues with animal husbandry. And this is always a challenge, right? Because people care about their animals. They're important parts of their life. In some cases, they might be a source of food for them. In other cases, they might be a source of, even if they're a non-commercial property, they might be a source of some modest income, or they might just really like having goats, right? And so there's a value there, and people do their best to take care of these animals. And sometimes I think they're sort of caught off guard when they in fact have a really negative situation, like having one of their animals, killed by a cougar. But there are some, small steps that can be taken that reduces the risk. There's some big steps that can be taken to really reduce the risk, if not eliminate it. And sometimes you can mix and match these to your best success. Now, the best thing you can do is board your animals at night. And in some cases, this is what I would sort of think of as like a big investment. Like if you could build a barn, build a barn. But of course, not everybody can build a barn. Not everybody wants to build a barn. But even sort of simple, low cost boarding structures for livestock can be really, really effective for reducing conflict. And in fact, if you go online, there's all kinds of blueprints that exist for how to do this. Not so much here in Washington, but in California, there are organizations that they'll actually come out and build the structure for you. They do cost sharing, that sort of thing. I'm only speaking for me here. I'm not speaking on behalf of the agency, but this is something I certainly hope that my agency does in the future, is that maybe they start providing some cost sharing or providing some ability to provide these structures to people, because I think it would go for a long way. Now, some of the things that you can do that would cost you less, of course, is if possible, situate your pasture as far away from the forest edge as possible. Reduce cover in the pasture, vegetation, large and small vegetation, so shrubs, trees, that sort of thing. Again, I mentioned earlier that cougars are a stalking predator, and so they really don't like being out in the open. I mentioned fences here, but fences are kind of like, can they help? Yes, but reality, a cougar can vertically leap 30 feet. I've seen them do it. So unless you're planning on building a version of the Great Wall around your property, fences are not the best solution, the most economical solution. I mean, yes, having a good fence is better than not having a good fence, but it's definitely not a silver bullet here. Things like motion sensing lights, though, around the pasture, playing human voices, these are things that look to have some effectiveness at keeping cougars away. The last one I have listed there, the livestock guard dogs, this is one that I consider a bigger investment. Getting a guard dog, paying for the guard dog, feeding the guard dog, there's a cost there. However, there's good evidence that livestock guard dogs are very, very effective with reducing the risk of cougar depredations and stuff. So anyway, there's a lot of different skills. I would encourage folks to go to the department's Living with Wildlife homepage. There's lots of good information and tips there that includes some of this information. Now, the other big one, of course, and for folks who don't have pets or they don't have livestock, and where you're most likely to have an interaction with a cougar, is when you're recreating, right? Hiking, camping, hunting, trail running, these sorts of things. Anything that sort of puts you in the places where cougars are most common. These are pretty simple steps, in my opinion, and unlike some of the stuff related to depredations, pretty low cost. First and foremost, I just like people to tell people, just be aware that you're in cougar country. Be aware of your surroundings. Like, know that you could encounter a cougar at any given moment. I mean, if you come away from this talk at all, one thing you'll probably realize is that whether you want it to be or not, even your backyard is part of cougar country, at least from a cougar's perspective. And so just having that situational awareness and sort of going into whatever you're going to do, knowing that you could encounter a cougar and having an idea of what to do if you did, you're already ahead of the curve. That makes a huge difference. And so when you're out there making noise, recreating with groups, these are things that also, cougars by and large tend to be pretty shy. They like to avoid people for the most part, even though they spend considerable amounts of time in areas with people. Most of that, when they're out and about moving, they're doing that in the middle of the night to avoid us. Also, control your dog. We've had situations where the dog is out hiking ahead of the person. The cougar, bumps into the dog, and the dog comes running back to you and brings the party with it. So keeping your dog close by I mean, ideally on leash. I'm not going to tell you to put your dog on a leash. I'm the worst person in the world about that, because as soon as I get to the woods, Timber is off leash, and we're doing our thing. But he's always within earsight of me. He's always responding to my commands. That's a just sort of, keeping your dog close by is a good strategy. Also, do not approach wildlife. Just don't, especially if you find something dead. If you come around the corner and there's a dead deer in the trail, probably should not approach that. There's probably a reason why that deer is dead. And it may in fact have been a cougar or a bear or something like that. In terms of your risk, now, the risk of actually encountering a cougar, I say this again and again, is very, very small. However, if you're engaged in recreational activities, typically mountain biking, trail running, or turkey hunting or elk hunting, something where you're all decked out in camouflage and mimicking the species that you're trying to harvest, you're at an increased risk of encountering a cougar. Now, again, that risk is small, but your risk is greater. And so I'm not going to tell you don't ride your mountain bike after work. Again, just be aware, like, this is something that could happen. And really, one of the best things you can do is carry bear spray, because I'm fond of telling people bear spray is not just for bears. Bear spray, you can use bear spray on moose. You can use bear spray on cougars. You can use bear spray on creepy dudes that you meet at the trailhead. Like, if it has like a mucus membrane and eyes, like, I will tell you a very quick story about a time when I was incidentally bear sprayed. And that was my former mentor and good friend, when I was but knee high to a grasshopper and a young man looking to learn everything I could. I was working with a local biologist, and who had pretty extensive cougar experience. And of course, he had bear spray. And I said to him, I was like, "Hey, how far does this stuff spray?" He's like, "Oh, I'll show you." So we went out on this logging landing, where it was nice and open. And he's like, "Yeah, this will shoot like 35, 40 feet. And he's like, "Watch." And he does it. And sure enough, it shoots this huge cloud 35, 40 feet out there. And then the wind promptly changed and blew it all back in our face. And people always think about bear spray. They're just like, "Oh man, it must burn your eyes." Yes, as a matter of fact, it does burn your eyes. What you don't realize it does, it sucks your breath away. It's hard to breathe, and it's painful to breathe. And it's very, very effective with cougars. And what I like about it is it's inexpensive. There's lots of different options, typically around $40 to $45. The big thing is to have it on you. If you're like mountain biking, don't put it on the bike. Make sure it's on you, because if you bump into a cougar or you wreck out and your bike's over there and there's a bear here or a cougar there, like, you may not be able to get to your bike, but you can always reach for your chest. Don't have it in your backpack. Don't have it in your fanny pack. Have it on your belt. They make chest harnesses, lots of different ways. The big thing about bear spray is it's not pepper spray. Pepper spray that you would get at like a gun shop or the sporting goods store. That's for people, and it shoots a little stream, and it doesn't have the necessary amount of capsaicin. Any decent bear spray is going to have a minimum of 2% capsaicin. And so that's really what you're looking for. Now, in terms of evaluating risks when you bump into these animals, the key really here is reading their body language. The figure here is pretty self-explanatory. Most of us know cats. They kind of know when cats are relaxed versus when they're not. They'll pretty much tell you that. And I'm going to leave you with just a few more steps in the very, very unlikely event you actually bump into a cat. The first and foremost thing to do is stop, stand tall. Absolutely, positively, do not run. To a cat, run means chase. That includes my little tabby cat, who could be dead asleep in the living room and I roll the ball across the floor, and who's immediately on top of it, right? They are a very instinctual predator. They're also a visual predator. small kids, small people tend to be at greater risk. It's a economics kind of equation. And so if you have small kids with you, pick them up, put them on a stump, put them on a log, hold them, or at least bring them close to your body to make them, less vulnerable. The visual part is really important here. If you do come face to face with a cougar, do not break eye contact. Again, they're a visual hunter, stalking hunter. If you're looking at them, they know you see them. So they're less likely to approach because they've lost that element of surprise. This is different than a bear. You don't want to maintain prolonged eye contact with a bear. So bear, don't stare. Cougar, keep it eye to eye. This kind of piggybacks off the piece about kids. Make yourself as big as possible. Raise your arms up, yell, wave. Again, it's economics. You want to risk, you want to build that cost side of the equation when you're dealing with these animals. If you have stuff you can throw at them, throw it at them. No one's going to think you're a terrible person because you threw rocks at the cougar. It's totally acceptable. Like, again, make yourself the threat to the cougar. They tend to be shy. They want to avoid injuries. Reinforce that you're not prey. And in the very, very, very unlikely event that you're actually are attacked or there's physical contact made, do everything you can to stay on your feet and fight back aggressively, poke in the eyes, poke in the ears, do whatever you can. Will you sustain injuries? Probably. Again, I sustain injuries if I cross my 15-pound tabby the wrong way. But people that have been attacked and have fought back, by and large, have survived. And so, again, it's probably not going to happen, but in the event that it does, it's just, knowledge is power in these sorts of situations. Lastly, I don't want to end on the idea that you're going to get attacked by a cougar. Instead, I'm going to end with I could give you hundreds of examples of times that I was very, very close to a cougar. And had I not had the technological advantage of a radio collar, I would have never known they were there. So I took this picture of a cougar roughly 20 feet away from me on Tiger Mountain State Forest outside of Issaquah many years ago. I have lots of pictures like this, but I like to show you because there is a cougar very, very close right there in the picture, staring at me. I was looking slightly uphill. And so if you got good eyes, you'll see him right there. And just to kind of point it out, there's his right eye, left eye, there's the top of his head. You can see his ear a little bit, and you can see a little bit of his body. But again, these animals, by and large, are doing a pretty good job of coexisting with us. And so that's what I'm going to leave you with, not the idea of being attacked. And so, as per usual, I talked more than I meant to talk, and I went longer than I meant to go. But I'm happy to stick around to answer as many questions as I can, as many questions as folks have. And again, thanks to the Spokane Audubon Society and Gary for reaching out to me and allowing me to come talk shop with you. So thanks. That's what I got for you. And let's see here. Going into the questions here, and I'll probably just yeah, I caught that too. I was like, oh, way to kill your credit. I had a misspelling in the title. I fat fingered it, which way to kill your credibility right out of the gate. Okay, a question here. It says, it seems like cougar attacks happen more in California and the South more so than up here. Is that because of more prominent urban sprawl down that way? So in fact, cougar attacks are not equally distributed across the landscape. The overwhelming majority of cougar attacks have happened in two places: California and Vancouver Island, British Columbia. Now, California is most likely the result of the fact that California has over 40 million people and probably close to 6,000 cougars. There are still there's still, even with that many people in California, there's still lots of cougar habitat and lots of cougars. And most interactions, it's about maximizing the spatial and temporal overlap between cougars and people. And California is a good example of that. There's just a lot of spatial and temporal overlap with it. And with that many, like, your individual per capita risk of being attacked by a cougar is pretty small, but the risk of an actual cougar attack is higher just because there's a greater, the dice keep getting thrown more often, if you want to think about it that way. Vancouver Island is very, very different. Vancouver Island is home to what many of us suspect is probably one of the most aggressive subspecies of cougars in the Western Hemisphere. The current working hypothesis is that because it's an island, there's a finite amount of land that exists. So over time, natural selection has probably favored cougars that are more aggressive because they had to compete more intensively for space. And for whatever reason, that has sort of carried over into attacks on people. The cats just tend to be, they tend to be less shy around people. That there's not a lot of great evidence. That's just sort of the hypothesis, but without a doubt, there are like something's going on in California and Vancouver Island. So yeah, great question. Okay, let's see if I can scroll down here to the next one. All right. Someone was asking, well, Alan, I could, you were asking about, presentations on wolves. I do presentations on wolves, although some of our wolf folks that we have do some pretty great stuff. And I know a lot about wolves, but they know more. So yeah, if you had like one of our wolf biologists, our wolf specialists, if you're interested in wolf talk, I can connect you to them, and you would probably get an outstanding, super knowledgeable talk from them. Probably better than what I would give you. Lots of things. Well, that's it. Lots of thanks from people. That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, unless anybody else.
Yeah, Brian, I guess I'd put a chat directly to you, so it's not showing up in the
okay
area. But I had a question about here in Eastern Washington. What kind of housing density does it take to not scare off the cougars?
So basically, the actual number that we found for the Eastern Washington so there were 3 Eastern Washington study sites: Okanagan, Cleelum, and then Northeast Washington, which was actually the wedge, or what we call the wedge, GMU 105, which is in between the Columbia and the Kettle River, going to the Canadian border. And those study areas, it was basically about, I think it was like 58 houses per square kilometer. Once you got above 58 houses per square kilometer, cats didn't use those areas. So anything below that, depending upon how it was configured and things like that, cats would use it. Now, it's not just the residential development patterns, just the difference in east side and west side forest structure. West side forests obviously tend to be, well, much wetter, much more densely vegetated. And so you have this sort of synergistic effect of not only the density being concentrated in a smaller part of the landscape. A cougar is just easier to get. It's just easier for cougars to get close to people in Western Washington without being detected than it is in Eastern Washington, because those typical dry forests, those ponderosa pine forests, tend to be more open, so there's less cover for the cougar. So the thinking is cougars just are a little more cautious in those landscapes, versus Western Washington. Like I'd seen them, 50 feet from people's backyards with a lawnmower going, and they just don't really seem to care. And it's because I think they feel pretty secure in that situation that, nobody's going to stumble on them, kind of thing. So yeah, good question.
Can you put that in acres? 58 per kilometer.
Oh, geez. Well, let me do this. I think so. 1 square kilometer is 1,000 square meters, and like the 1 hectare is, geez, I always do stuff in metric because it's all just tens. It's like kind of easy. A square, well, let me give it to you in miles. The easiest way to do it is, so 1 square kilometer is equivalent to 1/3 square miles. So 3 square kilometers is 1 square mile. So it's actually a pretty coarse scale. This is maybe getting further in the weeds than we need to, but we did have some thinking, like, I bet you if we did this at the hectare, which is 100 meters by 100 meters, which is more close to an acre, right? I actually bet those development levels where a cat drops off aren't that different. I think at a fine scale, cats are sort of seeing things the same way, and that whole diffuse versus dense would fall out, because at a fine scale, it's either developed or it's not developed. At the coarse scale, it's all kind of developed. It's just along a gradient. So at that fine scale, I actually bet you that it's pretty much the same everywhere you go. That would be, I haven't actually gone back and analyzed the data, mainly because that analysis was such a nightmare, and publishing that paper was such a nightmare. I think I have PTSD, and none of us want to revisit it, even though I do very much have that question. So yeah. Let's see if there are any others in here. Oh, okay. So I have a question here about what is the criteria for putting a cougar down? For example, one was euthanized last year north of us when seen at a school. So WDFW does have policies, and I will say, as I'm explaining this, I will say that our policies are currently, we're redoing all of that stuff, and there's a big, like, there's a lot of work going into it. I think the most basic way to sort of explain it is, if we think that there is a legitimate risk to public safety, that individuals is going to be lethally removed. Like, it's just, when in doubt, we typically err on the side of caution. We tend to err on the side of people. If there is any kind of physical contact between a cougar and people, that cat absolutely will be, if we capture it, that animal will be removed. There is a lot of gray area, and there's a lot of room for sort of decisions to be made by the responding officers of Fish and Wildlife Enforcement, conflict specialists, and those individual officers have different risk tolerance levels, and so it can be pretty variable. I mean, you can have some officers who would remove a cougar in this case, a cougar that was seen next to a school. They might do that every time. They have, their tolerance for risk is very, very low. You have others who the cat, might run through the playground, in the morning before kids are there, and they're just like, hey, that's not a legitimate risk. Like, hey, be aware it's there, that sort of thing. I will tell you my own personal perspective. Again, this is not the agency, this is me. I tend to be pretty risk tolerant just because of all of the research that I've done and things I've seen. Overwhelming majority of conflict that we have with cougars is depredation. It's livestock. Sometimes it's taking pets, and killing a goat is not necessarily a human safety risk. It can be if the cat was very, very bold in its actions. If it's, ran across the porch chasing the dog, like that's a different situation. But like a a goat out in the forest in the middle of the night that gets hit by a cougar, my perspective is that may not be much of a safety risk and stuff. But again, this is the real challenge, and our folks struggle with these questions all the time, because public safety is incredibly important to us. Minimizing property damage or risk to livestock is really important to us. But at the same time, we're trying to do right by wildlife populations, by cougar populations and stuff. And so it's some of the hardest work we have. It's some of the most challenging in terms of people. Our enforcement officers, our conflict specialists that sort of do this stuff for a living, it's really hard. And as human populations increase, but our cougar population is still doing well, this is just something that sort of happens. So yeah, I mean, in some cases there's very, very clear criteria, again, if they make physical contact with the person. Other times there's just a lot of, it depends on your experience and your discretion and things like that. So that's probably not as clear an answer as maybe you were hoping for, but I think it's kind of a real answer. So yeah, good question though. I don't see anything else here in terms of questions. Of course, I mean, if folks have any, feel free to chime in, but
Brian.
yeah. Yes, Madonna.
I was wondering, you said that in a lot of Western states, wolves kill cougars, but in Washington, cougars kill wolves. Why the difference?
Well, some of that could be we just haven't documented it, but I'm sure that somewhere a wolf has killed a cougar in Washington. But at least relative to like the Rocky Mountain states, we just haven't seen those direct effects like they have. We don't have definitive understanding of why that is. The way I think about it, and sort of my working hypothesis, is that Washington is excellent cougar habitat. And I would argue that Washington is better suited for cougars than it is for wolves. It's rugged, it's densely forested. When you think of like some of those Rocky Mountain states, like if you've ever been to Yellowstone and been into the Lamar Valley and kind of looked at like that is classic wolf habitat. And even parts of like central Idaho where it's just much more open. I just think the landscape is much more favorable for cougars. And the reality is we kind of have big cougars here. Like our cougars here in Washington, because I don't want to get too nuanced here, but just in terms of how our hunting seasons are structured and the type of animals that, like, it's unusual to find a cougar in Montana that's bigger than 120 pounds, just because hound hunters tend to prefer larger adult male cats. And so those are the ones they're targeting. There's enough hunting pressure that cats never really get old enough and large enough to exceed 120 pounds. Like the average male cougar in Washington is like 155 pounds. That's a really, really big cat. So I just think physically here in Washington, they're just better able to handle wolves. And then you combine that with the fact that the terrain is more conducive to cougars. And then lastly, our wolf packs tend to be small. Like, we do have some wolf packs that, at times that have exceeded 8, 9, 10 individuals. But in reality, most of our wolf packs are like 4 to 6 individuals. So it's much more likely, I think, here that cougars are encountering, solitary wolves or small groups of wolves versus, encountering the full wrath of the pack. And I think that makes a difference. I think there's a threshold. Again, it's largely speculative. There's not great evidence because, if you talk to some of the wolf researchers and wolf biologists in other states, they're just like, what's going on there? Like we didn't see cats like smoking wolves like you guys do. They do see it up in BC though, like on Vancouver Island and things like that. So, It's an interesting question. It's one I'd like to, to take a crack at, but that seemed, I mean, that's kind of how I think about it. Let's see. Other questions here. Oh, from a distance, how do you tell a male from a female? And the short answer there is you really can't. You really can't. Even I might, at a distance, I can't do it. Up close, or closer, if like binocular, spine scope, I can, or a trail camera, I usually can, like, adult males are pretty easy. They're just so much bigger. Like they're just, and particularly two things. One, they have this massive basketball sized head, where females have their head is actually kind of small relative to their body. And then in terms of muscle mass on the front shoulders, like all cats have these great big burly back haunches, but the males and the dominant toms, they just have huge shoulders, and on down through their legs to their paws are just really big. So it depends on how far away. I mean, but in reality, like most cat sightings, it's like, is that a cat? Did I see a cat run across the road? Like you're debating whether or not you even saw one, and you might, like, it might stop on the road and then it goes. You wouldn't be able to do it then. In reality, everyone's like, oh, I saw this huge cat. And it's funny when it's a cat that I know from a study, like it's got a collar and stuff. In my mind, I'm like, yeah, that cat was 88 pounds, which to me is a little cat. But to this person, it was like, it's like, man, I just saw an African lion. I just saw an African lion. So they always look bigger than they are. So it's definitely a crapshoot. But again, if you get up close, or if you get a good picture of them, I'd like to believe I'm better than 50%. I'm better than a coin toss, but I don't know if I could prove. I mean, we'd have to do a pretty extensive, study to determine how accurate I really am. I just say it with confidence. Oh, that's a male. Yeah. Okay, so how big? Let's see here. How big is the cougar population in our area? Tina, what's your area? Like Northeast Washington, Spokane County, like what's?
Spokane County. Because I've heard here, my neighbors, actually, I live right before a canyon drop off, and they've said that they've seen trail cams. They've set up trail cams of cougars here, and we're just right outside Airway Heights, right by the military base, but just the Spokane area.
Okay, so Spokane. So, I mean, on average, cougar densities are basically like, when we talk total cougars, like kittens on up to great big adults, you're probably looking at around 3 cougars per 33 square miles. That's generally, we say, 3 cougars per 100 square kilometers. But again, to maybe in a unit that's a little more familiar, it's like 3 cats per 33 square miles. Spokane County, I think you're probably pretty close to that. Like, I think you might be a little higher than that, depending upon, whitetail populations and how they're doing, that kind of thing. But I wouldn't expect much of a deviation from that. As you move north into sort of Stevens and Pend Oreille counties, where you have pretty robust prey bases, you're probably looking at a higher density. Not anything outrageous, but it's definitely, from my perspective and having worked there for 5 years on the Predator Prey project, we didn't actually measure density, but just sort of looking at home ranges and overlap and things like that, it's probably on the upper end of the distribution of like documented cougar densities. So yeah, so I mean, again, depending upon like how much area you're talking about, you just have to sort of scale it up from 3 per every 33. It's algebra. It's terrible. We were all hoping there'd be no math tonight, but you'd have to solve for X, right?
Yeah.
It's 3 per 33 square kilometers, and we've got 200 or 33 square miles, and we've got 200 square miles we're interested in. solve for X, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. Yeah, it
Okay,
is. It is. I will say this though, it is the great challenge of cougar management is like, how many do you have? Like, and how much confidence do you have in that number? Because we can give you a number, but that whole confidence interval that bounds that number tends to be a lot wider than we want it to be. And perhaps relative to other species, like as a percentage of that value, it's much, much bigger than we'd like it to be. The number, the accuracy might be good, the precision, yeah, it's a challenge for sure.
Well, it's interesting you brought up about them eating beavers as being the milk duds of the natural world there. I worked at Turnbull and I just work in the visitor centers and go on hikes. I came across a half-eaten beaver and I'm like, whoa, and it was huge. So I told the biologist about it. I was like, would the coyotes do that? And he's like, no, it was a cougar. Like literally, like it seemed like it was like bit in half, really like, and then after that, just the tail was left. So they had thought it was right at Turnbull, and they said they're there. It's just they're very elusive.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting is that tail is really, really, if you've ever like seen a beaver, and that's, the tail is very fat laden. It's very calorie rich, and at least in my experience, cats they'd eat that tail.
Yeah.
And stuff, and I mean they pretty much eat, like I said, all of it except for you find like half the skull and a set of buck teeth.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they were just assuming what it was just by, I guess, like the bite marks or whatever that was on it and what was
and
gone.
it could have been. I mean, it's always tough to tell unless you see it for yourself.
Unless they have.
But yeah, but it is. They do it. And what was interesting was it tended to occur primarily in the winter time, and I don't know. I don't know why that. I don't know why that was. I wondered if maybe beavers were more vulnerable because with the in the winter, if you had the water, the surface water of wetlands and things like that freezing up, if that beavers, when they're out of the water, they were maybe more vulnerable. I really don't know, Oh, look at Alan doing the math there. Yeah. Alan gets the gold star tonight. Yeah, now the only thing I would say about that 3 per, that's everybody. That includes kittens. Usually, like when we talk about that independent aged, you're usually around 2, so like, adult size or cougars 18 months and older sort of thing. So yeah, I try not to do the back of the envelope stuff because then it becomes gospel. Like at some point, one of you is going to be in a conversation at some point and you're gonna be like, yeah, the researcher from WDFW told me there's 162 cougars in Spokane County. And I guarantee at least somebody's going to say, yeah, there's more than that. That guy doesn't know what he's talking about. There's more than that.
Wait.
Hey, Brian, do toms end up killing each other?
Out of time?
So wait, so Gary, was that you? Was that your question, Gary? And then what do you?
Yeah, my question is, do toms tend to end up killing each other? Is that their primary?
Yes.
How about males, females?
Males killing other males, what we'll call what's commonly referred to as intraspecific strife, is the most common form of natural mortality for cougars, or at least male cougars. Injuries sustained while trying to capture prey, diseases, those are also common sources of mortality. But males killing other males is very, very common because those territorial battles don't always occur. Like they're not always fight to the death, but a lot of times the injuries sustained in those fights are lethal. Yes, males will kill females. It's not terribly common, but it's not unusual either. It's not rare, is what I'm saying. Those tend to be cannibalistic events, like they'll actually eat the female. And in some cases, there's a growing body of evidence that, and I've seen this a couple of times myself, when females have entered senescence, I've seen a couple of senescent female cougars that were killed by males. Now, whether or not that was why they were killed by the male, don't know. I mean, the male could have encountered the female in the hopes of reproducing, and when she resisted, I don't know. I can't speculate, but it does happen. But the male, let's see here. Give me a sec. I've got cougar skulls on my shelf here, and some of which, this is a pretty good one. Actually, this is a better one. Yeah, this is a better one. If you guys can see this on my camera. So this was a male that was killed by another male. And the easiest way to sort of see this, so these are both males. So if I can get my angles right, you can kind of see those are usually fatal, right? Or that's where most fatalities occur, is when the canine punctures the brain. Cats, their wounds tend to, when cats fight other cats and stuff, same thing happens with domestics. It's not uncommon for those wounds to become infected because of the bacteria that are present on the canines and things like that. So those wounds will often be septic. And so the cat that was bit may not die immediately, but they'll develop abscesses that then spread, and then ultimately they die of an infection, a week or two later and stuff. But yeah, and in fact, let me see if I got all kinds of goodies around here. My wife says I have too much death in my office. You can't really see here, but I've got a lot of skulls all over the place. But I do actually have a subadult female in here someplace that was killed by a male, and that skull was fractured in half and stuff. So yeah, it does happen. Yeah, it's tough to be a large carnivore. Woody, question.
Yeah, Brian, I'm wondering if you looking at your data regarding what cats killed and ate, pretty wide range of critters. Did you ever find a cat or group of cats that kind of became specialist on one particular prey? And I'm thinking of Kenny Logan's work in what was it, New Mexico or Colorado?
Yeah, so I have seen that, in fact. So two examples. One was actually, I did have a cat that was kind of a beaver specialist. That got really good at that. The other one, I'll grab you another skull here. Hang on.
Okay. I love this.
This very, 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 very nice mountain goat that I have here was the result of one of my adult males that would routinely. So here in North Bend, we have not a ton of mountain goats, but we have a decent mountain goat population that resides there. The middle fork of the Snoqualmie River comes out of the Alpine Lakes Wilderness. It's the western slope of the Cascades. There are, you could go to Mount Si outside of North Bend on a summer evening and count 25 mountain goats on the rocks there, at salt licks and things like that. Anyway, I had an adult male who was a mountain goat specialist. Now, the overwhelming majority of his diet was deer, but he routinely would go up on Mount Si to go after goats. And this guy was a very, very large mountain goat that I found that he had killed. And did I scream with excitement when I saw that mountain goat laying there because of how big it was? Maybe scream wasn't right. Did I get giddy? Yes, I did. I got very giddy because that's, mountain goats are really, really cool animals, and to have this is one of the perks of the job kind of thing. But yeah, so anyway, I have seen that. And in fact, I did have one of the cats up in the predator prey project. I didn't, you didn't see it a ton, but he was one. I mean, he was a big cat. He was almost 180 pounds. He could go after moose. Like he could go after moose. It wasn't super common, but yeah, but the guy killing mountain goats was definitely one that I would consider a specialist. Most specialists for cougars like that you see is it tends to be in systems with bighorn sheep. And what happens is you have mule deer that overlap quite extensively with bighorn sheep. And so again, they're mainly eating mule deer, but you get a couple of cats in the population that figure out like, oh man, I know how to catch these things. And so, they can do that and get pretty good. That's my Labrador pushing his way in here. So yeah, so it is pretty common in population. Like specialization is not common like throughout the population there, but there's always a couple of cats that kind of do their own thing. And in fact, one of the tribal researchers I know talked about they had a cat that was like a raccoon specialist on the edges of Olympic National Park, which that cat must have been killing a lot of raccoons, but it was just a thing that it got pretty good at. Yeah. Cool. Anything else you got for me? This is getting late, and I don't want you guys to feel like you have
I
to
was
keep
going to
throwing
say it's
questions.
9 o'clock.
Yeah.
If there aren't any pressing questions, I think we should call it. But Brian, this has been a fabulous program. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. I know I've really enjoyed it.